The Church Growth and Giving Show, your resource for growing faithful communities. Brought to you by Vanco, helping tens of thousands of churches thrive for over 20 years. Join Jordan and Hannah as they share insights drawn from decades of church giving and engagement expertise.
Today we're diving into something that might sound a bit technical, but is absolutely crucial for church financial health: charts of accounts.
That's actually a perfect topic for today's show. I hear from so many church leaders who are a bit intimidated by church accounting, but a good chart of accounts is literally the foundation of healthy church finances.
I think a lot of our listeners might be in the same boat. Like, we know it's important, but could you break down what exactly a church chart of accounts is?
So, at its core, a chart of accounts is basically just a list of all your church's financial transactions. Think of it as the organizational system for your church's money story. You're typically categorizing everything into five main buckets: assets, liabilities, equity, income, and expenses.
I see. So it's kind of like creating folders for sorting all your financial papers, but in accounting form?
That's a great way to put it, Hannah. And what makes church accounting unique is that it uses what's called fund accounting, which is a bit different from business accounting. Churches need to track donations that might be restricted for specific purposes, like a building fund or mission trip, because the person who donated them designated them to go for that specific purpose.
Could you explain a bit more about those five main categories you mentioned? I think that would be really helpful for our listeners.
Of course! Let's break them down one by one. Assets are things your church owns, like your building, vehicles, or money in the bank. Liabilities are what you owe, like mortgages or bills that need to be paid,
And what about equity? That's probably less familiar to most people.
right? In church accounting, equity is often called net assets. It's basically the difference between what you own and what you owe. Then we have income, which for churches is primarily tithes and offerings, and expenses, which cover everything from staff salaries to utility bills.
That helps make it more concrete. So when you're setting up these categories, how detailed do you need to get?
It really depends on your church's needs, but generally, you want enough detail to track everything clearly without making it overly complicated. Each of these main categories will have subcategories. For example, under expenses, you might have separate categories for utilities, maintenance, ministry programs, and staff costs.
And I imagine this helps when it comes time to review the church's financial health?
Exactly. When everything is properly categorized, you can easily see where money is coming from and where it's going. It makes budgeting, reporting, and decision making so much clearer.
So what makes a church chart of accounts different from, say, a business chart of accounts? I imagine there are some key differences.
The biggest distinction is what we call fund accounting. Unlike businesses that focus on profit and loss, churches need to track every dollar to ensure it goes where the donor intended it to go.
Could you give us an example of how that works in practice?
Sure, let's say someone donates specifically to the youth ministry building fund. That money must be tracked separately and can only be used for that purpose. It can't be moved to cover general operating expenses or other ministries, even if there's a shortfall.
Ah, I see. So it's about honoring the donor's intentions.
Exactly. And there are other unique aspects too. Churches don't have traditional revenue streams like product sales. They rely primarily on tithes and offerings. Plus, there's no concept of owner's equity, since churches aren't owned by shareholders.
What about the terminology? Is that different too?
Yes, churches use different terms for many standard accounting concepts. For instance, what businesses call retained earnings, churches refer to as net assets. And instead of customers, we have members and donors.
That makes sense. It sounds like fund accounting requires extra attention to detail.
It definitely does. Each restricted fund needs its own tracking system within the chart of accounts. This helps ensure transparency and maintains the trust of your congregation. It's not just about good bookkeeping. It's about being faithful stewards of the resources God has entrusted to the church.
And I imagine this affects how churches report their finances too?
Absolutely. Financial reports need to clearly show both restricted and unrestricted funds, making it easy for church leadership and members to see exactly how donations are being used and that designated gifts are going to their intended purposes. A shocking statistic I came across recently is that researchers estimate nearly 7,700 churches close each year, and financial mismanagement is often a contributing factor.
Wow, that's sobering. I never realized the numbers were that high.
Yeah, it really puts things in perspective. The good news is that churches that implement transparent financial practices actually see increased giving. A recent study showed that 57% of churches saw more generous giving when they were open about their spending.
It seems like there's a direct connection between financial transparency and congregational trust.
Absolutely. When members can clearly see how their donations are being used, they're more likely to give generously. It's not just about the numbers, it's about building trust and showing good stewardship.
And I imagine those churches that closed might have avoided that outcome with better financial practices.
That's exactly right. Many of these closures could have been prevented with proper financial oversight and transparent accounting systems. When churches maintain clear financial records and communicate openly about their finances, they're much more likely to thrive.
These statistics really highlight why having a proper chart of accounts is so crucial.
They do indeed. And remember, it's not just about avoiding problems, it's about creating a foundation for growth and ministry impact. Churches with solid financial systems are better positioned to serve their communities effectively.
So, what are some good software options churches can use to manage their chart of accounts effectively?
There are several excellent choices designed specifically for churches. Popular options include ACS Technologies, Church Windows, and even QuickBooks, which now has specialized features for fund accounting. These programs really streamline the whole process.
What should churches look for when choosing accounting software?
The key is finding something that matches your church's size and needs. You want software that can handle fund accounting, track restricted donations, and generate clear financial reports. It should also be user-friendly enough that multiple staff members can work with it.
I imagine ease of use is pretty important, especially for smaller churches that might rely on volunteers.
Exactly. And that's why cloud-based solutions are becoming more popular. They allow multiple users to access the system securely from different locations, and they usually include automatic backups and updates.
What about implementation? How does a church actually get started with new accounting software?
The first step is to map out your current financial structure and decide how you want to organize your new chart of accounts. Then, you'll want to set aside time for proper training, not just for the primary users, but for anyone who might need to access the system.
That makes sense. Is there typically a transition period?
Yes, most churches find it helpful to run both systems parallel for a month or two to ensure everything transfers correctly. It's also important to choose a start date that aligns with your fiscal year, or at least the beginning of a quarter.
Are there any other implementation tips you'd recommend?
Document everything, create written procedures for common tasks, maintain a list of account codes and their descriptions, and establish clear protocols for who can access different parts of the system. This becomes invaluable as you train new people or handle staff transitions.
Oh, that's helpful. So, what would some specific examples look like?
Let's say you're tracking cash assets. Your checking account might be 1100, savings 1200, and petty cash 1300. For income, regular tithes could be 4100, special offerings 4200, and facility rentals 4300.
Could you walk us through how churches should structure their numbering system for accounts? I know this can be confusing for many people.
Absolutely. The standard approach is to use a 4-digit numbering system that breaks down your accounts into clear categories. The first digit typically indicates the main category: 1000s for assets, 2000s for liabilities, 3000s for net assets, 4000s for income, and 5000s for expenses.
And what about breaking those down further?
That's where sub-accounts come in. If you have multiple ministry departments, you might have something like 5,100 for pastoral salaries, 5,200 for youth ministry expenses, 5,300 for worship ministry. Then you can break those down even further. 5,210 might be youth ministry supplies, 5,220 for youth events, and so on.
That seems really organized. How detailed should churches get with these numbers?
You want to find the right balance. Too few categories and you lose important detail. Too many and it becomes unwieldy. I generally recommend having enough detail to track major ministry areas and important expense categories, but not so much that it becomes confusing for your accounting team.
What about those restricted funds we talked about earlier? How do they fit into this system?
Those typically get their own series of numbers. Many churches use 3100s for unrestricted net assets and 3200s for restricted funds. Then, each restricted fund gets its own subnumber, like 3210 for the building fund or 3220 for missions. Unfortunately, there are several pitfalls I see churches stumble into. One of the biggest is overcomplicated account structures. Some churches create so many detailed categories that it becomes unwieldy and confusing, especially if multiple people are handling the bookkeeping.
I can imagine that would get messy fast.
It definitely can. Another major mistake is failing to separate restricted and unrestricted funds. If someone donates specifically to the building fund, that money can't legally be used for general operations. Your accounting system needs to clearly track those restrictions.
That sounds like it could create some serious problems if not handled correctly.
Most definitely. In fact, it can lead to both legal and ethical issues. Churches are stewards of the money given by their members, and there's a sacred trust there. Proper accounting helps maintain that trust.
What other common mistakes should churches watch out for?
A big one is relying too heavily on a single person to manage the accounts. If only one person understands the system and they leave or become unavailable, it can create a real crisis. It's crucial to have documentation and cross training.
That's a really good point. What about keeping records?
Yes, poor record keeping is another common issue. Some churches don't maintain proper documentation for transactions or don't reconcile their accounts regularly. This can lead to errors that compound over time and make annual reporting a nightmare.
Are there any technology-related pitfalls to be aware of?
Absolutely. Some churches either resist using modern accounting software altogether, trying to manage everything in spreadsheets, or they invest in sophisticated software but don't properly train their staff to use it. Both scenarios can lead to serious problems.
What about regulatory requirements? I know churches have some tax exemptions, but are there still accounting rules they need to follow?
Yes, even though churches have special tax status, they still have several important regulatory requirements. First and foremost, they need to file W-2s for all employees and 1099s for contractors. This is non-negotiable under IRS rules.
And what about regular tax returns? I've heard churches are different from other nonprofits.
That's right. Churches aren't required to file Form 990 tax returns like other nonprofits, but many choose to do so anyway for transparency. It's considered a best practice, especially for larger congregations.
Are there any other financial standards churches should follow?
Churches should generally follow GAAP, that's Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, for their financial statements. This ensures their books are maintained in a standardized professional way that outside auditors can understand.
That makes sense. Are there special rules about handling donations?
Yes, churches need to provide giving statements to donors for tax purposes, and they must maintain accurate records of all contributions. There are also strict rules about acknowledging non-cash donations and properly documenting restricted gifts.
What about payroll regulations?
Churches need to follow all the standard payroll regulations, including proper withholding of taxes and Social Security. There are some special rules for clergy compensation, like housing allowances, but these need to be properly documented and reported too.
It sounds like there's quite a bit more regulation than people might expect.
There is, and staying compliant is crucial. Churches can face serious penalties for noncompliance, even if the mistakes are unintentional. That's why it's so important to have good systems in place and possibly consult with a tax professional who understands church finances.
If a church is starting from scratch with their chart of accounts, do you have any resources you'd recommend?
Definitely. There are some great templates available online specifically designed for churches. The article I was reading mentioned a free church chart of accounts template that guides you through the setup process. Also, the IRS website has specific guidelines for religious organizations that can be helpful.
That's super helpful. And what about churches that already have a chart of accounts but know it needs improvement?
In that case, I'd recommend starting with a review. Look at your current structure and identify pain points. Are there categories that are never used? Areas where you need more detail? A good practice is to review your chart of accounts annually, ideally before your budget planning process begins.
That makes sense. Would you suggest bringing in an outside expert for this, or is it something churches can handle internally?
It really depends on the size of the church and the expertise available. Smaller churches with knowledgeable volunteers can often handle it internally. Larger churches might benefit from consulting with a CPA who has experience with nonprofit accounting. There are also firms that specialize in church finances.
Those are great options. Before we wrap up this section, are there any other key points about church charts of accounts our listeners should know?
I think the main thing to remember is that your chart of accounts should serve your church's mission, not complicate it. Keep it as simple as possible while still providing the information you need. And make sure multiple people understand the system. Don't rely on just one person to manage all the financial knowledge.
That's such important advice. Financial transparency really does create trust, and that's so crucial for church communities.
I also wanted to mention, for our listeners who want to dive deeper, we have some amazing resources available. We've put together a church finance kit that includes templates for committee agendas, budget planning, and financial statements. Over 2,000 churches have already downloaded these resources. We also have a complete guide on chart of accounts for churches.
And you can find these templates on our website or in the show notes. These will give you a great starting point for organizing your church finances.
And as always, we'd love to hear from you. If you have questions about church accounting or suggestions for future episodes, please reach out to us through our website or on social media.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to another episode of the Church Growth and Giving Show. We'll be back next week with more insights and practical tips for helping your church thrive. In the meantime, please subscribe to our YouTube channel to get the latest tips, resources, and more.